We're going to look today at another setting of Thomas Hardy by Finzi, and I have here my trusty Thomas Hardy complete poems in which a young man's exhortation can be found. And here on the front, I'll just lean forward a little bit in case you can see, is a very typical photograph of Hardy, a distinguished English literary personage with a moustache and a bald head. And that's the picture that we don't want to have when we're thinking about a young man's exhortation. Because when we look at the poem in the collected works, we see at the end 1867 Westbourne Park Villas. So this was one of the poems that Hardy had, if we believe that, written when he was working in London as an architect in his 20s. And then chose in 1922 and actually published in 1923 to include it in a general gathering together of some earlier poetry. And this was taken up by Gerald Finzi in the late 1920s to set as the opening song in his cycle, and it's intended to be a cycle, A Young Man's Exhortation. It's the first song, the title song. Now, Finzi, of course, at this stage would be in his late 20s. So here we've got two young men writing poetry and music, and we must get rid of all sorts of preconceptions, therefore, and I'm afraid I think they do linger, about Finzi as the post-war, perhaps slightly tinged with sentiment figure from our point of view because we knew about his early death. It's got nothing to do with that. So here is a young man writing music in the late 1920s. What a wonderful time to be a composer in London. And if you go to Stephen Banfield's book, you can find quite an extended survey of the sort of music that Finzi, together with friends like Howard Ferguson, was experiencing in London. It's a very exciting time, talking about Stravinsky, Walton, and so on. And it reminds us that if you consider Finzi to be slightly a conservative figure musically, then that's by choice. And it's not through lack of any possibility of writing in different ways. And that seems to me to be a very important thing to realise about Gerald Finzi. Composers make decisions, and the decisions that Finzi took musically, I think, were often quite bold and were certainly not conservative in a negative sense. And we're going to be able to look at some of those in this first song of A Young Man's Exhortation. So we'll go over to the piano. Finzi chose a tenor voice for the whole cycle and for our song A Young Man's Exhortation. Given the title, it's not surprising that he chose a male voice, and indeed Finzi often wrote for baritone or tenor voices. But before we spend too much time thinking about that as a focus that Finzi seems to have had, it's worth remembering that perhaps his most famous piece, Dies Natalis, was originally conceived with a soprano soloist in mind for its first performance, although it has rather been taken over by tenors now. The tenor voice is particularly important for looking at a feature of Finzi's writing for the piano in this piece. The writing is contrapuntal, that is a series of interweaving lines which together create the harmony and also the texture, interweaving also with the tenor voice itself. And one of the things that I think is notable about this song, and notably successful, is the way in which the piano so often keeps out of the area just below middle C and just above where the tenor voice is situated. And you can hear it in the opening bars of the piece because the first two phrases are wonderful poetry. Call off your eyes from care by some determined deftness. Some determined deftness. It's a wonderful phrase. And Finzi gets the piano out of the way so that we can hear the singer in those wonderful words. the piano isn't there. It's not masking the voice. Now, what that also enables Finzi to do is to point out the imitation, which is a customary musical technique when you're writing contrapuntally, the imitation between the different lines of the piano and of the voice. Listen out for this idea. Call off your eyes from care, thy son. So we hear it first of all, top, middle, and voice, call off. So he gives us that idea 3 times. And that will recur. It comes again in bar 4 in the piano, in bar 6, and so on. And if you go to Stephen Banfield's book on Finzi, he spends quite a lot of time looking at this idea of what he calls the head motif. And I thought it worthwhile just explaining a little bit what that involves. It's a piece of terminology that's often applied in the late Renaissance and early Baroque music, composers such as Orlando Gibbons in their church music, where accompaniment ideas will focus around a short. Here it's often just that rising fifth, a short idea that by reappearing in different parts allows the music to develop along a path. It's not a structure, it's not anything like rondo or anything like that, but it's linking different passages as time goes on in a piece by use of a consistent musical idea. I want to turn now to look at stanza 2. Now, when I first read Stephen Banfield's account and he said the head motif appears then in stanza 2, I thought, no, it doesn't. That's not what I remember, because most of us, I think, and Finzi probably intends this, our attention is drawn to the tenor's line. Suddenly much faster, exultant crown the hour that girdles us, and filled it full with glee, blind glee. Our attention is on the quickening of the pace, on the high tessitura of the tenor line, including the highest note of the piece on a top A, and given to the word blind. Poor tenors, I have great sympathy. It's a really hard word to sing high in the voice. So bravo all tenors who sing this song. It's also really interesting, that word blind, because it's actually the start of the second line of Hardy's stanza. So it goes, and fill it full with glee, blind glee, excelling aught could ever be. But Finzi has chosen to run the 2 lines together so that we're not aware of the start of that second line. It stops the music becoming periodic in a perhaps rather formulaic way. And that's what Finzi's been doing at the start of this stanza as well, because the tenor takes us over with his exultant style, almost so we don't notice that truly, as Stephen Banfield says, the piano does begin with our head motif. We almost don't notice it. We're so taken with what the singer is doing. So there is our head motif, and there is our exultant outpouring of a young man's enthusiasm. This is an I can do anything song. After that, we move through our head motif again in the 3rd stanza, beginning now in A major. So we've now moved from A flat major at the start to F major to A major. But as we go through this 3rd stanza, we begin to wind down a little bit, because the song is going to move to Hardy's very reflective last 5th stanza. And I think Finzi's handling of mood here is really strong. It's a great indication of how he can handle a non-strophic, mood-like setting of a poem, which in Hardy's version just looks like 5 verses on a page. The 4th stanza takes on this more reflective style. It winds the music down even more. It slows down. Introduces new rhythms. We can tell that something reflective or of interest is coming, that Finzi wants us to notice in Hardy's poem. And the music also slows down because when we get to that little march idea, which is something Finzi likes, it's going to come back a little bit with the cider maker later on in the cycle. But interestingly, harmonically, it keeps going back to that D, so that we also have a harmonic slowing down of the piece, because we're actually sitting on a pedal D all the way through the last two lines of the fourth stanza. But it is the fifth stanza that is, I think, Finzi's crowning achievement here, and the crowning glory of the song. First of all, the fifth stanza has no bar lines. It's completely in free time, and the singer is allowed to sing collo voce. The piano has to go with the voice. There is complete freedom. Hardy also has given Finzi some beautiful images here. If I have seen one thing, it is the passing preciousness of dreams. Now, when I first heard this song, it was that phrase, preciousness of dreams, that stuck in my head for hours afterwards. And it similarly always does when I hear this song. But what Finzi also does is to put his own stresses into Hardy's poetry. If I have seen one thing, Finzi puts a stress mark over that word one. It's his interpretation of Hardy. And this is where composers put their mark on poetry in a very distinctive way. What is it about that phrase, though? It is the passing preciousness of dreams. Well, if you've watched the Lisby Brown video, it's our old friend, chord number 3, the mediant chord, a minor chord within the context of D major in this case, a chord of F sharp minor. Hardy could not have wished for a more intuitive setting, I think, of that phrase. Many other composers, given that tune that Finzi thought up, would have just given us a D major chord. It's a masterstroke, I think, in harmony there. And as some of you will know, the other masterstroke comes at the end of this fourth stanza. That aspects are within us, and who seems most kingly is the king. And again, Finzi puts stresses over those last two words, the king, and gives us the most unexpected chord. Is the king. A chord of E major within the context of D, on which the song ends. And we sit taken into another world. I hope you enjoy the song.